Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Holocaust and Japanese internment. And one thing that you're going to have to know for today is a term called genocide. And this is the systematic and purposeful destruction of a racial, political, religious, or cultural group. So essentially it's where someone tries to kill everyone who belongs to a certain group. So let's say if there was people who wanted to kill all Christians, which is a religious group, that would be a genocide. Or it could be a racial group. Somebody said they wanted to kill all Hispanics. Could even be a cultural group. Like if somebody said they wanted to kill every single person that's El Salvadorian, that would be a genocide because you are trying to eliminate a cultural group. And we're going to talk about there was a genocide during World War II. And Hitler of Germany tried to get rid of all the Jews, which Jewish people are a certain, it's a religion, but it's also an ethnic or cultural group. So the final solution is Germany's solution to exterminate, which means to kill all Jews. So Hitler wanted to kill all Jewish people, and there was a few other groups that Hitler also wanted to get rid of. Those were Poles, which are people mainly from Poland, Slavs, people from Slovakia, Gypsies, which is another cultural group, and then also what he considered undesirable. So people that were homosexual, so it'd be gays or lesbians, mentally ill, he wanted them exterminated as well, or political descendants. Those are people who did not agree with him. He wanted them killed. And this all led to the Holocaust, which was the mass murder of 6 million Jews under the German Nazi regime from 1941 to 1945. And this was almost 2/3 of Jews living in Europe were killed. And there was others that were affected, like I talked about before. That's the Poles, Slavs, Gypsies, undesirables, which were considered homosexuals, mentally ill, and political descendants. And the Holocaust is an example of a genocide because Hitler wanted to completely get rid of these groups. He didn't want a couple Poles, he didn't want a couple Jews, he wanted to get rid of all of them, which makes it a genocide. And what he did is there was something called concentration camps. So Germany sent Jews and others affected by the Holocaust, and he sent them to concentration camps, which was essentially a prison. And once they were there, they were forced into labor, so they had to work. And the prisoners were given very little food. Lots of times they weren't even given any food. And most died from hunger, and many were killed when they became too weak. So if they were too weak all of a sudden, they couldn't lift anything. Usually Germans would just shoot them and kill them. Though the popular thing that Germans did was poisonous gas. They would put them in rooms and fill it with gas so it would kill them. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen pictures of these before, but these are, this is a concentration camp. There would be men, women, children here, and they just had these tiny beds, and you can see how skinny they were. They wouldn't feed them. And this is a famous picture of one of them is after they killed someone, they would take off their jewelry. So one of the concentration camps, I mean, you can see this is just one place, all the rings that they took off dead people. So the Holocaust was definitely very bad. And this was going on during World War II. And it leads to the Nuremberg trials. So after the war, Nazi leaders, which Nazis is Germany, and others were convicted and found guilty of war crimes. Many were sentenced to death or life in prison. And the important thing was this emphasized an individual responsibility for actions during a war, regardless of orders received. So in other words, you can be found guilty of war crimes even if you were told to commit crimes. So you can't just say, oh, my commander or my boss told me to kill these people, so sorry, someone told me to do it. Nope, if you commit a war crime, you can be charged for it after the war. And this also led to an increased demand for a Jewish homeland. So what this means is Jewish people, they wanted their own country, and Jews eventually received a homeland after the war named Israel. So Israel is a country today. That's a country that Jewish people were given after World War II. We're also going to talk about prisoners of war. So prisoner of war is different than a normal prisoner. Like you might be thinking of if you get arrested for killing someone or for stealing something, you're a prisoner. But prisoners of war are soldiers, essentially. If you're fighting in a war and you lose, you get the soldier. And before World War II, there was something called the Geneva Convention, and this established international rules concerning the humane treatment of prisoners of war. So this says prisoners should be treated well. You can't starve them, you can't do anything like that. And international means the whole the whole world has to follow these rules. It's not just an American thing, it's not just a German thing. But if you arrest a soldier and they become a prisoner, every country in the world has to follow the Geneva Convention because it is international. And there was a very big difference in how prisoners of war were treated. The treatment of prisoners of war in Europe more closely followed the agreements of the Geneva Convention. So prisoners of war in Europe were treated, they're still prisoners, but they were treated well. They weren't punished, they weren't beaten, they weren't tortured. However, the treatment of prisoners of war in the Pacific often reflected the savagery of fighting as displayed in the Bataan Death March. So, in the Pacific against Japan, soldiers were treated much worse in Japan. So if you're an American soldier, you'd rather be caught in Germany and Europe than by Japan, the Pacific. In the Bataan Death March, this took place shortly after Honolulu was attacked. Remember, Pearl Harbor was attacked in Hawaii. Japan actually took over the Philippines, which was an American colony at this time. And American and Filipino soldiers were forced to march, which means walk, up to 70,000 miles. 1,000 American soldiers died during the march, and 9,000 Filipino soldiers died during the march. And most of them died because they didn't have food. And they were told to walk essentially for like 4 days straight with no food, no water. So most of the soldiers that died, they just got too weak and they died. Next, we're going to be talking about the treatment of Japanese American civilians. So when I say Japanese Americans, these are Americans. They just have Japanese ancestry. But remember, if you're born in the United States, you are an American citizen. So the Japanese Americans we're talking about, most of them are American citizens. And Japanese Americans on the West Coast were relocated to internment camps, which were prisons as a result of strong anti-Japanese sentiment and the fear that Japanese Americans were aiding the enemy. So the United States, a lot of people, because we were fighting Japan, didn't like Japanese people. So even though you're American, if your grandfather was Japanese and you look Japanese, you were not going to be treated well. And people were afraid they were going to help Japan out in the war. There was never a single time where they actually found evidence that Japanese Americans were helping Japan, but the American government still put them in jail. And the Supreme Court upheld the government's right to act against Japanese citizens living on the west coast of the United States. These are example of internment camps. Like this is an internment camp right here. See, it's definitely not nice, but they still had electricity, they fed them. Nothing like a concentration camp. Japanese Americans were treated much better, but a lot of these Japanese Americans, if they had a home, they lost their home, they lost their business, and they didn't make money. They were forced to be in these prisons while the war was going on. And much later, in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed into law to provide a presidential apology and a symbolic payment, which is money, to the internees. Evacuees and persons of Japanese ancestry who lost liberty or property because of discriminatory action by the federal government during World War II. So during World War II, the United States, they forced people who are Japanese ancestry into these prisons. So it took a long time, but in 1988, the American government apologized. They said, sorry, we should not have done this. That wasn't right. And they gave the people money because they went to prison. So it was their way of kind of saying, sorry, we screwed up. We shouldn't have done that. Today, that can't happen. Like if we went to war with Spain, we're not going to get every single Spanish person and put them in prison just because we're at war with Spain. But that's what we did with Japan. We went to war with Japan. So everybody that had Japanese ancestry, they put them in jail. It's not right. That's why the government apologized. And hopefully it never happens again. All right, that's it for today. If you guys have any questions, let me know.